I was 7 or 8, and my great Uncle Silas nearly 70, when his only son Abel was married to a girl named Georgina, and we all drove over for the wedding in the black and yellow trap, with the white racy-looking horse, my grandparents and parents, my aunt and I, before the dew had dried on the buttercupped grass one May morning. The air was rich and summery, and the sun was a long time breaking through the mist as we drove along. The wedding had come upon us suddenly. The girl, Georgina, had arrived that springtime to be a lady's maid at the house where Abel had been a gardener for nearly 20 years. It was all over in a month, done, as my grandfather said, all of a damn pop. Nor did my grandmother like it. She was a little pale woman, like a faded canary, and as quick-tongued as she sat perched on the high trap seat in a grey and purple silk. I thought she looked as if she would like to peck at the creature who had seduced a solid, hard-hatted fellow like Abel with such indecent haste. Abel was nearly 40, and the girl, it seemed, was only 19. But it was to be a great wedding. We talked of it as we drove along. "I should think," said my grandmother, "he's well set to work, marrying a filly like that." 19! But my grandfather had seen the girl. "Dall it all," he kept saying, "she's flash, and don't she talk nice? Just so. Ho dear, ho dear. I tell you, she's lovely." "Yes, without her farting to bless herself with, I'll be bound. Who's paying for the flash wedding?" "Silas, I expect." "Ah," said my grandmother, "and I'd Silas him if I was there at Anne. I remember the last wedding we went to with Silas." My grandfather evidently remembered it too. He suddenly looked embarrassed, nudged my arm, and pointed with his driving whip at a cuckoo flying fast across a field of beans, calling as it flew, its voice trembling with the motion of its flight. My grandfather followed the bird until it alighted far off in an ash tree, and then he nudged me again and told me to look up, straight above, at a lark breaking into passionate song, and we turned our faces to the sun-misty sky and watched the bird twittering up and up, out of sight. "You'll get something you don't expect," my grandmother warned us, "cocking your eyes at that bird," said my grandfather to the horse. "And look at you," exclaimed my grandmother suddenly. "Whoa, I never saw such a man in all my born days. You'll be hanging yourself in the reins next." "Whoa," said my grandfather gloomily. The horse stopped, and my grandmother leaned across me and seized my grandfather's collar, which had sprung away from its stud, catapulting his necktie away and releasing his white starched dicky from its top buttonhole. "Hold still," urged my grandmother. "That comes of gaping at birds instead of driving on as you should do." She fixed the collar, smoothed the tie, and flattened the dicky, and my grandfather, looking extremely meek and ill at ease in the iron starch collar and front and his best black clothes and hard hat, drove on again, straining his sun-tanned neck so that the guides taunted in agony. "Lord, man, anybody think you'd been hung?" said my grandmother. As we drove on, the mist began to disperse, the sun shining through at first softly, and at last with the strong thundery heat of the May morning. "I don't know," said my grandmother, as though in hope, "as that girl ain't going to have a wet ride after all." It was 5 miles to my Uncle Silas's house, and though the wedding wasn't until 2 o'clock, we had started the journey at 10 o'clock in the morning. There was no sense, declared my grandmother, in not making a day of it, nor, said my grandfather, did we want to wrench the guts out of the horse. So we had started early, and we drove along all the time at the same solemn pace, the horse never breaking into a trot, my grandfather never using the whip except to flick away the flies, and now and then we would stop, perhaps to admire a field of young barley, or to have a word by the roadside with a man my grandfather hadn't seen for a year, or to gaze at the bluebells staining the dark earth of the woods we passed. At every hill we stopped, so that my parents and my grandmother and aunt could alight and walk up the hill. My grandfather and I remained in the trap, sitting well forward in the seat in order to relieve the strain on the horse. And once, going up a hill by a spinney, we heard a nightingale, and then another, and another, singing fitfully, but with breaks of wild passion in the young hazel trees. Cuckoos were calling continuously in their full, bold mocking, and when we stopped to listen, it sounded as though the cuckoos were contradicting the nightingales, their monotonous cries half drowning the others, wild, spasmodic singing. "We must ask your Uncle Silas," said my grandfather, "if he knows two nightingales." "He'll have enough to think on," said my grandmother, "with that other nightingale." It was nearly 12 o'clock when we arrived at my Uncle Silas's house, the little reed-thatched house standing at the top of the violet-banked lane by the spinney of pines. The lane, steep and narrow, was cobbled with white, hoof-smooth stones, and at the bottom of it we all alighted, my grandfather and I leading the horse. "Dalit!" exclaimed my grandfather as we came within sight of the house. "Can I see straight?" We all stopped on the crest of the slope, and my grandmother let out an exclamation of tart astonishment. "A tent! What the nation do you want with a tent? Ain't that just like Silas?" "It might be Georgina's doing," said my aunt. "I heard she'd got money." "Aye, Georgina her!" cried my grandmother as we went on. As we came nearer the house, the tent, which had been erected in Uncle Silas's paddock, seemed larger than ever. A big square marquee, like a sort of squat steeple, the canvas as white as the moon daisies growing thicker than the grass in the field. Little yellow and green and blue and scarlet pennants fluttered about it listlessly, and its ropes were as clean as new straw. Long trestle tables had been erected both inside it and on the surrounding grass, and waiters in shirt-sleeves were already rushing hither and thither, spreading cloths even whiter than the tent, arranging flower vases, carrying glasses and cups and plates and cutlery, salt-silvered hams and joints of beef and roast fowls and loaves and cheese, dark bottles of wine and cases of beer, and stone jars of homemade, unloading them from a wagon which had been drawn up before us by two satiny black horses with their ears in little silk nets, and their tails plaited and tied with bows of white and cornflower blue. "It's her later," said my grandfather, who seemed, I thought, to be not so much astonished as delighted. "Look at them bottles." "You look at what you're doing," said my grandmother. And very slowly we all walked on to the house, marvelling at the tent, and the food-laden tables, and the sweating waiters. Just as we drew up behind the wagon, an extraordinary figure in yellow corduroy trousers, a blue shirt, a yellow waistcoat, and a squashed brown Panama came rushing excitedly out of the house, carrying a tray of glasses and bottles with one hand, and trying to keep up his trousers with the other. He was waddling on his thick-bowed legs across the paddock, chuckling wickedly, when my grandmother arrested him. "Silas!" she shouted. "Do you want to blind us all?" "Lord Almighty!" said my Uncle Silas. "I never seed you." He stopped abruptly, and still holding up his trousers, came rolling back across the paddock towards us. I whispered to my mother, "Why can't you walk straight?" "Shh!" she said. "It's the heavy bottles." From the way in which my grandmother began to address my Uncle Silas, it seemed as if it were the heavy bottles. "Silas," she said, "you ought to be ashamed of yourself at 12 o'clock in the morning." "I am," he said wickedly. "And what's happened to your trousers?" "They'll be down any minute." "Silas, you're not responsible. Where's Sarah Ann?" "Gone down to church to titivate the altar." "I'll titivate you in a minute," she threatened. And before Silas could move or speak, she was off towards the house, nipping along in her inexorable, quick, bird-like fashion. When she returned, a moment or two later,
My Uncle Silas was already trotting out for the waiters and my grandfather and himself, the beer in the glasses shining a rich, tawny dandelion gold in the noon sunlight. He was standing at one end of the long trestle tables, pouring out beer with one hand and still holding up his trousers with the other, when she arrived behind him. He had no chance with her.
"Stand still," she said,
seizing his trousers.
"It's a darning needle."
With her lips set tartly, she proceeded to sew on his lost buttons, her hands spider-quick and neat with the thread.
"I'm surprised at you, Silas," she would say, "and if you touch that glass, I'll prick you."
My Uncle Silas stood with a sort of meek wickedness, winking at the waiters.
"And what about this girl?" said my grandmother. "Didn't waste no time, did she?"
"Nor did you."
I said, "What about her?"
"Lovely."
"And who's paying for all this tent and all?"
"Her Marquis," my Uncle Silas corrected her. "Her Marquis."
"Well, whatever it is, you ain't paying for it, I hope."
"Lord Henry and Lady Esther," said my Uncle Silas, "are paying for every mite and morsel."
"Everything?"
"Every drop and crumb."
"And the tent?"
"And the Marquis." My grandmother had no more to say. She had finished. She put the final stitch into my Uncle Silas's trousers and stuck the needle into some invisible place among her skirts. My Uncle Silas drank his beer at one draught, and my grandmother seemed to be so flabbergasted that she did not see him pour out another, not only for himself, but for my grandfather too. She stalked off into the house, and my parents and my aunt followed her. My grandfather and I stayed with Uncle Silas and the waiters, marvelling at the meat and drink that the men kept unloading from the wagons. The heavy summer air, fragrant already with the scents of grass and roses and the old lilac trees near the garden, was thick also with the smell of meat and beer and new warm bread. "I never seen arms like 'em," mouled my grandfather. "No, and you never will again," said my Uncle Silas. We went into the marquee and marvelled again at the joints, the roast ducks and chickens, the salads and wines, the bright cherry trifles, the wine jellies, the strange sauces and cakes and finicky titbits and sweets all arranged on the long white tables. "Is there any mortal thing in the eating line you ain't got, Silas?" said my grandfather. "Nothing," said my Uncle Silas.
"Where's Abel?"
"Skulking upstairs like a young leveret. Frit to death." When we left the marquee and went across the paddock towards the house, my Uncle Silas bawled out, "Abel!" An upstairs window opened, and Abel put his head out. Abel looked as though he had been carved crudely out of raw beef. He had a thick black wig of hair, and the eyes of a mournful cow. There was something sleepy, simple, and pathetic about him. I believe my Uncle Silas was eternally ashamed of him. "Damn it, man," said my Uncle Silas sharply. "There's half the guests here already, and you're still abed."
"I ain't abed,"
said Abel.
"I'm buttoning me shoes up."
It was more than my Uncle Silas could stand.
"Buttoning me shoes up,"
he muttered, waddling off.
"Buttoning me belly button."
And following him, we went into the garden. There we heard the nightingales again, one after another, tuning up, half sharp, half sweet, the notes enriched by the sultry summer air under the shelter of the pines. The scent of lilac in the full heaviness of its blossoming was like a drug, marvellously fragrant. The green peas were bursting into white flower, and the first roses were crimsoning the white wall. Their glossy leaves splashed with the white droppings of the swallows, flying to and fro to nest under the thatch eaves. All the time we were in the garden, my Uncle Silas talked more garrulously, more excitedly than usual. And he was still very garrulous and excited when the cabs and wedding flies drove up the lane to take us to church. And I remember saying to my mother again as he walked down the lane with us, Why can't you walk straight?"
"Shh!" she whispered. "It's this rough lane."
We all drove to the church in flys and cabs, drawn by white horses with polished hoofs and silk-ribbon bridles. There were more than 100 guests, a great dazzle of white dresses and white buttonholes, and my Uncle Silas looked magnificent. There was a sort of purposely devilish splendour about his light grey coat and trousers, his yellow carnation, his canary waistcoat, and his grey square bowler rakishly cocked askew, as if to match that everlasting devilish look in his bloodshot eye.
"Well," said my grandmother, "it might be a skill match to look at Silas."
The church was full, and I remember my grandfather saying to me,
"Don't want to hear a lot of popery and hymn singing, do you?"
We stayed outside together, looking for nests in the churchyard yews and reading the names on the tombstones until the wedding was over. It was not until then, when the church door opened and the guests and the congregation began to flock into the churchyard, that I saw Georgina.
"Ain't she flash?" whispered my grandfather. "Didn't I say so?"
She was unforgettably lovely, as she came from the church porch with Abel, who looked more than ever solemn and simple in his suit of blue serge, his bowler hat, and his light brown button boots, which squeaked a little. She seemed to me more beautiful, more spirited, more enchanting than perhaps she really was. She was very dark, her black hair and eyes shining vividly against her white wedding dress. Her face seemed full of a half-angelic, half-wicked vivacity, and the conflicting lights and expressions of pure naivety and passion. She was across the churchyard and in the wedding fly in a moment, and I did not see her again until we were all sitting about the long tables in the marquee, eating and drinking, and talking and laughing, with the sweating waiters rushing hither and thither, juggling with food and drink, madly trying to serve everyone at once. And at the table head, next to Georgina and Abel, sat my Uncle Silas, and opposite him Lord Henry and Lady Hester, for whom Georgina and Abel worked. Lord Henry put on an eyeglass and read a speech.
"I have great pleasure,"
and so on, which we all applauded by banging the tables, making the glass and crockery dance and ring. After him, I remember my Uncle Silas rose with a sort of noble unsteadiness to his feet, waved his hands, almost pitched forward, clutched the table in time, took a drink to steady himself, and began a long tipsy speech, which we almost drowned with our table banging and laughter, and of which all I can remember is a kind of refrain that he kept repeating as he gazed with a sort of sleepy, wicked admiration at Georgina.
"Afore the night's gone, we'll sing you a song. Me and the bride, eh?"
Georgina would smile without opening her lips, a marvellous, lovely, insinuating smile, and my Uncle Silas would wink and proceed with his speech, breaking now and then into long words which he could not pronounce with his drink-fuddled lips. "Silas has swallowed the dictionary," someone remarked.
"Don't know what it is,"
declared Silas, lifting his glass.
"Oi, but it wants a hell of a lot of washing down."
I could see my grandmother fuming, her lips set thin with exasperation.
"You won't catch me at another wedding with Silas," she said, "as long as I live, not if I know it. Silas," she said to him severely, when the feast was over, "you ain't responsible." "I know." "If you go singing one of your pub songs with that girl," she warned him, "I see you know about it."
He cocked his eye at her with purposeful devilishness. It was late in the evening, just after the May dusk had begun to fall, when my Uncle Silas and Georgina sang their song. My grandmother protested and threatened, not knowing whether she was more disgusted with Silas for enticing the girl, or with the girl for making a promise to sing a duet with a man who'd been drunk since noon. She retired to the house, excusing herself when she found that the dew was falling, but I stayed outside in the warm lilac-heavy air and listened. The guests had been dancing on the grass to the music of 2 fiddles and a piano brought out of the house. There was a gay atmosphere of laughter and happiness, and besides the fragrance of lilac and may blossom, a strange odour of bruised grass that the dancers had trampled down. My Uncle Silas and Georgina stood at the entrance to the marquee, and Silas took the girl's arm in his, and they sang "I'm 17 come Sunday," without the fiddles or the piano. Uncle Silas had the ugliest voice in the world, and the girl's contralto seemed exquisite beside it. She put an unexpected spirit and passion into her voice. "Will you come to my mammy's house when the moon shines bright and clearly, and I'll come down and let you in, and my mammy shall not hear me."
"Yes,"
said my grandmother, who listened after all from the house,
"and that's what she will do if I know anything."
All the time my Uncle Silas and Georgina were singing, Abel was watching her. His eyes never flickered or changed their expression of wide, mute adoration. He looked not only as if he would do anything for her, but as if he would forget or forgive anything she did. He seemed almost stupefied with love and worship of her. When the song was over, my Uncle Silas kissed Georgina with a loud smack. Abel smiled with the serenity of pure adoration, while the guests laughed and applauded. In the silence before the music began for dancing again, I could hear the nightingales singing unfrightened in the spinney, and the cuckoos, as in the morning, croaking across the darkening fields in mockery. It was past midnight when we harnessed the trap and lighted the lamps, and my grandfather led the horse down the lane. We could hear my Uncle Silas bawling, "We won't go home till morning," long after we were on the road.
"I'll never come within 50 mile of a wedding with Silas if I live to be 1,000,
my grandmother kept declaring.
"And what in the wild world are you doing, man? Can't you drive straight?"
My grandfather could not drive straight, and my grandmother, reaching suddenly across my sleepy face, took the reins from him and slapped them across the back of the horse.
"Lord, I'd Georgina that girl if she were mine. Kissing Silas, and he wasn't the only one she kissed either. Sarcy, ain't the word. Somebody's going to be led a fine old dance if I know anything about it. There's going to be trouble afore the year's out."
But there was no dance and no trouble. Georgina died suddenly in childbirth the following spring. My Uncle Silas is dead too, but I shall never forget their song, the girls' spirited loveliness, the feast in the marquee, the smell of lilac and wine and bruised grass, and the sound of the cuckoos contradicting the nightingales.